Life tests you in so many different ways.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball. Today our team preview is going to be looking at the Denver Nuggets. So Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. To help me preview the Nuggets, I am joined by the host of the Locked On Nuggets podcast. Adam Murray is here with me again. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Excited to do this. It's always fun to do this preview.
Yeah, so this is a team that where there's been a little bit of change, but in comparison to a lot of the other teams in the NBA, it is pretty solid and pretty similar to where we were with this squad last season. But that doesn't mean we still don't have things to talk about. So let's start where I have been starting with all of these podcasts pretty much, and that is by giving an injury update. First of all, the second round draft choice, Bol. Has he even signed a contract yet?
He has not, but it has been reported that the Nuggets are probably or likely to sign him to a two-way contract, which is a surprise to me. I kind of thought they would want to kind of push back decisions on him and have him on a regular contract, even if they were going to keep him in the G League all year.
Yeah, that is a little bit surprising, unless they're going to go for a 2-year, two-way deal. But it is a little bit strange they didn't give him one of those 3 years with non-guarantees at the end. Bol obviously slid quite a bit down in the draft, and I don't think anyone should have any expectations for him to contribute this year or really any year in the next couple with his injury history and all the concerns that led him to slide down the draft.
I don't know about several years, but I certainly think for this year, I've caught a little bit of conversation about him sort of impressing in his summer workout so far, being healthier than they anticipated and, just looking really good. I think he's a guy that's always going to look good in workouts. The weaknesses of his game are not, they don't get highlighted in 1-on-0 type thing. So not necessarily a surprise, but I do think he'll be in the G League for most of this year, if not all, maybe some garbage time minutes here or there. But I wouldn't say that he's like a 3 or 4 year project. One of the interesting things about the Nuggets going forward is they have Mason Plumlee, who his contract is up this year. They don't really have a plan at the moment for backup center. So maybe that is Bol. Maybe it's something else. But it's something to kind of be a storyline on the back burner for the Nuggets for now.
He's obviously one of those boom or bust type guys, especially for dynasty leagues. Again, no impact really this year, but maybe that is the situation that he does find himself in that role next year when Plumlee is likely on another team. But the bigger news, I guess, injury-wise, or the news we want to hear about is Michael Porter Jr., who missed all of his rookie season with that back issue. His summer league debut never happened because of a workout injury that occurred just before that started. What's the latest on Porter and his injuries? Will he be ready for the preseason and for training camp?
He will be, and he's been in town. A lot of the conversation when he got hurt the last day of camp leading into Summer League was that he probably could play. They were being extra precautious with him, I think, because of the injury history and just, wanting to get it to the season before he gets hurt. They held him out, but I don't think that injury was too serious. He has been in Denver working out. He's on Instagram doing, windmill dunks and everything else, doing contact. So, he'll be ready for camp. And he is, to be honest with you, he is the story of the season, I think, at least number one for the Denver Nuggets. So much, I want to say hinges on him because I think Denver's very, very good without him. They're fine without him. But I think a lot of the mystery around the team this year is going to be about, is he a positive player, a negative player, a non-player? Really could affect the team in a lot of different ways.
Where do you think he fits then in this rotation? Assume he's ready to go. Is he just going to slide in and play minutes immediately as, say, the backup small forward on this team?
That's what's so interesting about this, Josh, is I think there's every option is on the table. He could start. I've heard conversation from people around the team that say, hey, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he was one of the 5 best players on the roster. And if you look at guys like Ben Simmons, Blake Griffin, Joel Embiid, guys who missed an entire year but were very highly rated prospects coming into their redshirt season, those guys were very good in their actual rookie season, which would have been their second season. They were very good. They weren't like regular rookies where almost every rookie is bad their first season. They were certainly ahead of that scale. So if that's the case with a guy like Michael Porter Jr., then I think you can expect him to be one of a main piece and maybe even a starting caliber piece at some point. But the flip side of that is he also just could be bad. I mean, there's a million things that go wrong. He could be injured. He could not fit the system. He can't hold up for 82 games or whatever. And then on top of that, Denver has guys like Torrey Craig, Will Barton, Malik Beasley, Juancho Hernangomez. It's not like Michael Porter Jr. has one guy to beat and then, a scrub in the depth chart. There's guys that are competent to step in there. And so Denver doesn't have to have him. And there's even an argument to be made that maybe he's good but not great, but he's worse than all the other options because the other options have experience and are ready to go. So a lot kind of hinges on him. And I certainly can see a scenario where by the end of the season, he's a main contributor and a big piece and elevates their ceiling. And I can see a scenario where he's good, but raw needs time. And Denver has to decide, do we sacrifice a few wins to give him that time to grow, or do we just try to maximize what we have?
It's unlikely, even if he was starting, that he'd be an excellent fantasy option, just given these other guys around, so he's not worth looking at in most drafts. He also has deficiencies in terms of assist rate, steal rate, block rate. They've never been high throughout his previous AAU-type numbers. The shooting also, we have to see how that develops. There's a lot of unknowns there, but I agree. I do think he's got a chance to be in that rotation, and that is going to tie into what we talk about with a lot of these other players when we move forward to talk about this Nuggets team. Let's start with one guy who we don't need to talk too much about. I don't think that's Nikola Jokic. We know sort of who he is at this point. He's unbelievably good. He took his game to another level last season. I think he can actually go a little bit further this year. He only played 31 minutes a night last season. I think that we'll see him be a pretty constant top 10 player this year. And I think that if you've got pick number 6 in your fantasy drafts, Jokic is the guy that I'd be looking at in that sort of an area. He still only had a usage of 27%, but that upped in the playoffs. I think he'll see a little bit more usage as the regular season goes on and he starts again to really assert himself as a completely dominant force. Well,
that's the question I have is he has become more aggressive over the course of his career as a scorer and just kind of willing to step up and force the action and tell guys to get out of the way or whatever. He's become more willing. And in the playoffs especially, I thought that went to a whole new level. And maybe it's just one of those things where most guys learn this skill, and maybe he had it coming in that he just knows, okay, it's the playoffs, I got to push. It's the regular season, I got to coast a little. Maybe he has that in him. I mean, his body is the way it is for a reason. I think he understands how to coast and those types of things. But I do wonder with how aggressive he was at points down the stretch last season and in the postseason, if he comes into next season with just a little bit more confidence and aggression, and maybe, I think he was scoring 25 points per game in the playoffs. Maybe he is closer to 21, 22, 23 points per game just off of being aggressive. But my hunch is that you're right. His numbers will probably look a lot like they did last year. Maybe the 3-point percentage goes up a little bit.
Well, that's the other thing. He only shot 30.7% from three last year. He was a 40% three-point shooter the year before that. I'm not expecting him to be a 40% three-point shooter, but I am expecting him to improve pretty significantly on where he was last season, which I think will push him into that 6 or 7 spot for fantasy. But yeah, again, if you got Jokic, you know who he is, you know how good he is, you know what he can provide. Let's talk about now the Blue Arrow, Jamal Murray, someone who I guess from a fantasy point of view was a little bit disappointing last season. We did expect him to take a bit of a step forward, but his overall rank dropped just a little bit. He still increased his points per game, but overall his efficiency did fall off. True shooting went from 58 down to 54. Was he dealing with any sort of injuries during the year that would have caused that drop in efficiency, especially his 2-point percentage, which dropped by 3 percentage points?
No, I don't think there was anything wrong with him physically. But one thing you can kind of look at, Will Barton going down in the second game of the season. Gary Harris had basically a month of healthy play before all the injuries, he played through them. You look at Gary Harris's game total, and it's not that low. But most of those games, he was on one leg. So I think the burden of responsibility was on Jamal Murray more so even last year than what I think it will be this year, assuming just average health. So I do think that a lot of it just came down to, there was an entire month of the season where it was Jokic, Jamal Murray, I think Torrey Craig, Juancho Hernangomez, and I don't even remember who the other starter was, to be honest with you. Maybe it was Beasley or somebody else. So there was a whole month where there was basically 2 healthy starters, Jamal Murray, Nikola Jokic, and a bunch of reserves healthy. And both Jokic and Murray really stepped up and played great, but their percentages took a dip in that month. And I think that's a lot what happened with Jamal Murray last year. I think with everybody getting back to full health, he should get easier looks. And I think this is the year, if he is to make a leap, and I'm not convinced that he for sure is making a leap. I think there'll certainly be growth, but I don't know if this is a big leap year. But if it is, it's going to be an efficiency more than I think per game production, just because there's more threats on the court and just more opportunities for him to get easy assists and easy baskets.
I think it puts him still in that nice little 60 to 70 rank zone in terms of fantasy drafts. Both Yahoo and ESPN have him outside the top 70. I'd be more than happy to take him before that. And he could easily push into the top 50 sort of a range. But it would require that assist rate to jump pretty significantly and the steal rate, two things which are pretty unlikely to happen given just his history. He did put up a career high in assists last season, 4.8 assists. I'm just not expecting that to all of a sudden become 6.5, especially when Jokic is on the court and he's the one out there delivering those assists. You mentioned the injury to Gary Harris, or the injuries to Gary Harris, which did really limit him last season, just the 57 games. And only 29 minutes a game. He was a big disappointment for fantasy. The year before, he'd been the 41st ranked player. Last year, 168th. Minutes down, efficiency down. His true shooting went from 60 down to 53, and he'd had 2 consecutive years of 60 or above. I think that jumps up pretty significantly this year. But the other thing is the usage. With, you mentioned all these other threats around. What do we expect? Are we expecting Harris's minutes to go back up and the efficiency to go back up? How much of that was impacted by injury, do you think?
100%. I mean, if you look at his per game by month, in October, 7 games, he's averaging almost 20 points per game. In November, that's 16 and 16.2, and half of that was, he was starting to be injured at the back half of that. And then December, he misses the whole month. So, and after that, 11 points, 8 points, 10 points. I mean, that's where the average got really weighed down. So I think for him, it was, I think he's the most interesting returning player. There were moments in the previous season, not last year, but the one before it, where people questioned if he was certainly the second best player, but some people here in Denver, I think foolishly, but they still wondered if he was the best player, in large part because of, how big he came up, or how much he came up in big moments. So I think that last year was a real dip that in his sort of trajectory that had almost all to do with the injuries that he went through. He came back from one, injured another, and just all year he was kind of going through that. But there are 2 questions that I think are worth, from a fantasy standpoint, but also just from a value standpoint, about him as a player. He has now failed to reach the 70-game mark in 3 straight seasons. Yep. 57 games, 67 games, and then 57 again. And you start to wonder, is the guy injury prone? I mean, he takes incredible care of his body. He's a super athlete, no body fat on him. I like to think it's just a bad run of injuries that he's gone into, but this is the year that I think will really, if he misses a bunch of games, then I think that label is going to stick with him for the rest of his career. But the other thing is, Jamal Murray, when he went down, when Gary Harris went down and Will Barton went down, Jamal Murray really upped his game and upped just his usage rate and how much he was sort of responsible for generating the team's offense, taking shots and everything else. And when Barton and Gary Harris returned, they were not at full strength, but Jamal Murray continued to play that way. And one of the questions I have is Gary Harris going to have to sacrifice some of his touches and his value as a player in order to accommodate what's best for the team? Maybe, Jokic and Murray become the 1-2 punch and everybody else is just kind of filling in around. So that's one thing I'm kind of curious to see what happens. But if I were a betting man, I would say that I think Gary Harris has a relatively healthy season, in that the trajectory he was on before last season is more of an indication of what he's about to be for this upcoming season than last year.
Yeah, I think he's definitely back in the consideration to be a standard league guy, maybe not that top 50 player. He also saw his steal rate completely disappear last year, so that'll bounce back. I think his efficiency numbers will bounce back. I think his minutes will come back, and I think he'll be an interesting late round pick, although Yahoo has him ranked at 91, which I think is pretty fair. He's obviously upside there because we've seen him do it before, so he can be better than that. Whether he will do it or not this season, again, there's just so many other options around that it is a little bit tough to see how that usage goes back to where it was 2 or 3 years ago, which put him into that top 50 discussion. But if he comes back and averages 1.7 steals, then he jumps 30, 40 spots pretty quickly, and the value is right there.
Here's one other thing to kind of look at. His 2-point percentage for the last 4 years, 54%, 56%, 55%, and then last year, 47.5%. So at the rim, you really notice where he was hurt when you just look at he was not finishing anywhere inside the paint last year, and he was taking a lot more shots from outside the paint in the floater zone. And I just think you look at the numbers, that to me is a big anomaly. I think he bounces back.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think he is one of the big bounce back candidates for this coming season. Now, a guy that you and me spoke about after this trade went down in Vegas, that is Paul Millsap, and how the Nuggets are planning, he obviously didn't get traded, but how the Nuggets are planning on using him now that Jeremy Grant is there. And you seem pretty aggressive in terms of how much they were going to limit Millsap for this coming season. So what do you think he's going to start? How many minutes do you think that we're looking at for Paul Millsap for this coming season, his age 34 season?
I think he's definitely going to start, and there's a lot of talk here in Denver about whether he will or won't. But you look at the numbers when he's in the lineup over the last 2 years. Denver is winning at, I think, a 57 win pace over the course of both seasons. I mean, they're just so much better when he's healthy. And the Jokic-Millsap pairing, while it doesn't always look the prettiest, especially for a Jokic-led lineup, there's been some lineups where everything just looks, they look like the 7 seconds or less Suns where the ball's just moving and it's great. It doesn't always look like that with Millsap in the lineup, but the numbers don't lie. The defense is incredible, and the net rating over 2 years with those two guys just so good. Denver's been so good when both of those guys are healthy. So I think Millsap still plays, and he plays a lot. The number I'm interested in is that minutes per game. Last year, 27. It's a big dip. If you look at his career trajectory over the last 3 years, he's looking at 34 minutes, then 30, then 27. I wouldn't be surprised if that continued on the decline, and next year he was somewhere around 24, 25. Frankly, I think it's smart for him to extend his career. He's at 33. He's a big-bodied guy. He's a stocky build, strong build, sturdy guy. I think for him to get on that Andre Iguodala plan where he's playing 24, 25 minutes for most of the season, and then maybe down the stretch in that final 3 weeks, you ramp it up and start to get ready for the postseason where you're a main contributor. To me, that's the right sort of play for him. There's no need for him to be playing more than 24, 25 minutes per game in October and November most nights. And I think that'll probably be the plan. Allow Jeremy Grant to do the heavy lifting for most of the season. Maybe take 7 or 8 rest days throughout the course of the season, not play on too many of these like 4th game in 5 nights type deals, and see his production go down.
Yeah, I think that'll be the case for Millsap as well, that we'll see fewer minutes than last season. He did crack the top 100, 91st last season. I don't think he will this year. I think he is overranked on ESPN at 73. Yahoo's got him 115. I don't even think I'd bother taking him at the back end of drafts because there's very limited upside, because I don't think all of a sudden it's going to be, it's a big Paul Millsap breakout and he's going to play 35 minutes a night. That's just not going to happen. So I don't really think we need to worry about taking him in those lower or those end rounds. Now, the guy who's coming in to take those minutes and to ease the load on Paul Millsap is Jeremy Grant, who they stole off the Oklahoma City Thunder for a first-round draft pick. Grant played a pretty significant role for last season for the Thunder, 33 minutes a night. He also was a top 100 player. The 33 minutes a night, to me, feels like he won't be able to get there with Denver.
It's such an interesting question because I don't see it anywhere close to that.
Yes,
Mason Plumlee was also a great option at power forward last year, and really over the last 2 for Denver. Again, if you just look at the production when Jokic and Plumlee were together, it's been very, very good. So already you're looking at Denver has 2 very good options. I don't think they want to play Plumlee at power forward going this next season, but you still have 24, 25 minutes of Millsap at power forward. So that only leaves 24 or so minutes left for Jeremy Grant at that spot. He might play a little small forward, although I don't think that's a great idea. He might play a little small ball 5 in certain lineups, especially at home where you can really run teams off the court at Mile High City. So he's an interesting one. I don't know what his minute total will be. My hunch is it'll probably be somewhere around 25, 26 minutes per game. But the other side of the coin of that is, Denver moves the ball a lot more. They have a more dynamic offense, and there's very few players that have come in to this Jokic system over the last 3 years and not succeeded. Emmanuel Mudiay, Trey Lyles. Basically, that's the list of guys that have not looked great next to Jokic. And you look at Jeremy Grant defensively, I think it's a great fit. But then is he going to be able to spot up in the corners? He shot 39%, over 39% last year from the 3. He'll be getting some more great looks. And then I think the real question from him from a statistical standpoint, his rebound rate is not very good.
No,
it's actually surprisingly bad. And one of the things that makes players, especially at the power forward spot, really effective next to Jokic is their ability to sort of either crash the boards with athleticism or own the boards with strength, the way Plumlee does. And I think he's going to have to change his game to be a little bit more of an offensive rebounder and just more of a rebounding threat. But he's never played with a guy like Jokic, so maybe there is something in there for him to kind of tap into.
I don't think he's really worth too much of a draft pick again. He barely cracked the top 100 in 33 minutes last season, and those minutes, again, won't be there at that level. So he can be an interesting blocks streamer. He can hit your threes at a decent enough rate, but not someone who's really worth investing in. Now, a guy that really was a big letdown last season for numerous reasons, Will Barton. I didn't like the contract when he signed it. It's looking not great at the moment, especially with these other players who are stepping up into that role. He finished barely inside the top 200 last season, played 28 minutes, and I think, as you referenced, with Michael Porter there, perhaps taking that starting job. Like, what's Barton's role going to be this season? Will he go back and be that? Like 2 years ago, he played 33 minutes a night and was almost a top 50 fantasy guy. Is he going back to that, or is the ascension of Monty Morris, Malik Beasley, Juancho Hernan-Gomez in that mix, Torrey Craig there, who started over him in the playoffs at times? Like, where is Barton at the moment?
Yeah, so let me real quick. I want to go back to Jeremy Grant and just say he's a guy that I would. If I were a fantasy, guy that was really into fantasy, he's a guy I would make a mark of, like a watch list type guy early on in the season, because there is a chance that Denver's just saying, you know what, he is going to play a bunch. Millsap's going to rest a bunch. And there is a scenario where he fits really nicely next to Jokic. So I wouldn't draft him either, but he is a guy I would mark down to keep an eye on. Barton's season last year was the season from hell. Started off phenomenal. I always tell people I was so excited for Barton to be in the starting lineup because it was basically a 3-guard lineup. Barton, Gary Harris, and Jamal Murray, where all 3 guys were a shooting threat, a great cutting threat, and had great chemistry with Jokic, and could play that pick and roll game. So you had 3 pick and roll threats, along with one of the best, DHO pick and roll bigs in the game today. And I was just so excited about it. The first game, they go into Los Angeles and beat the Clippers on their floor. I think they one of 2 teams to beat them in the calendar year until January in Staples Center. And then they come home and they beat the Suns in a game that Nikola Jokic had a perfect triple-double. And to me, it was everything I expected that lineup to be, even though it was only 2 games. Denver just looked phenomenal. He gets hurt, and he was horrible when he came in. He never recovered from that injury. Yeah, and his game isn't the type of game to scale down. It's not like, okay, you're injured, you're not getting to the rim, you're not, your step slow, change up what you're doing. For whatever reason, that's not in him. He's just aggressive all the times, and he didn't have it last year. So it's a real mystery whether, one, Denver wants to move on. Torrey Craig did a great job in the playoffs at that spot. Michael Porter Jr. Obviously is going to get some minutes, even if he hasn't earned them early on, I think. And then a guy like Malik Beasley is a young player that has shown some upside. So there's other guys that can take minutes from him. And the question is he back to the player that I think he was 2 years ago, or has he sort of lost his moment? Was last year his chance? And now it's sort of passed him by. I don't know what to answer with that, and I don't even really have a prediction. I could see both scenarios. But last year was just such a disaster that his leash, I think, will be really, really short no matter what the scenario is.
Yeah, look, I don't think we should have any expectations of him getting back to being that top 50-ish guy that he was. He's ranked outside the top 200 on Yahoo. That's probably a little bit too low. ESPN's got him at 108, and I think that's maybe a little bit too high because, again, there are just so many other options there that they can use. Getting those 33 minutes out of Barton this season that he got 2 years ago, it seems really unlikely that he's going to get back to anywhere near that level. We have talked, actually let's talk Torrey Craig because there's a chance that he may not be in the rotation at all. Like if we're thinking that it's Plumlee, Jokic, Grant, Millsap, that's your 4 and 5. Yeah. Barton, Porter, Beasley, Harris, Murray, Morris. Like where is Craig fitting in? They have to be the 11-man rotation.
Oh, it's no doubt about it. You look at that small forward position, there's somebody getting closed out, and Juancho Hernan-Gomez is a guy who I've always loved, and I think he brings a lot to the table for the Nuggets, but I think he's another guy that just lost his chance, and so he's probably out. And then, you look at Michael Porter Jr., Torrey Craig, Will Barton. 2 of those guys are going to play. Maybe only one of those guys plays heavy minutes, depending on how the rotation. Most teams play a 9.5-man rotation or so. So I don't know. Torrey Craig is on the bubble for even being in the rotation. But what I would say is Michael Malone loves him. In the playoffs, he was phenomenal, in large part because he shot the ball well. So much of his game offensively comes down to whether or not he knocks down his shots. And during the regular season last year, really over the last 2 seasons, he's been somewhere around a 32% three-point shooter. And I think that's probably what he is. But when he does knock down his three-point shot, he's a very useful player because he is good defensively. He does get offensive rebounds and just kind of hustle plays. But teams also leave him open. Denver's offense is so high-powered, and there's so many ways for them to score that for the back half of the season last year, most teams just said, you know what, we're going to give Torrey Craig 5 open three-pointers tonight, and we'll see if he can hit more than one of them. So yeah, I don't know. He's a real wild card, but in that battle between Michael Porter Jr., Barton, and Torrey Craig fits Michael Malone's personality and preferred style more. I don't know that he's better or more impactful, but he certainly has that going for him, and that I think Malone wants as many defensive guys as he can get, especially on this roster.
Malik Beasley really took a step up last season in his third year. Super efficient scoring from Beasley, 47% from the field, 40% from three. Big steps up from what he'd done in either of his first 2 seasons. A true shooting of up to 60%, 11 points per game. Really did take advantage of the fact that Barton was out. Of course, from a fantasy point of view, he doesn't do anything else. He doesn't rebound, he doesn't get assists, he doesn't get steals, he doesn't get blocks, he doesn't get to the line at all. 0.8 attempts per game from the free throw line, which would, if he got there, it'd be fantastic because he shoots the ball well from the line, 85%. I think overall he's a limited fantasy player, but again, his ascension does hurt guys like Barton. And do you see him playing fewer minutes than what he played last year just because of maybe a healthier Gary Harris now?
Well, Gary Harris and Will Barton are 2 guys that take minutes from him, and both guys were out or injured for most of the season. So I think he's in line for a reduction. What I'd say about Malik Beasley, I think he's on the trade block for Denver at the deadline. And some team is going to get themselves a really nice seasoned young player. And what I mean by seasoned is you're not getting a guy that's like, okay, he's 2 years away. You're getting a guy who's ready to have his breakout year. But I just don't think he's going to get that in Denver. He doesn't defend as well as Gary Harris, so Gary Harris gets the nod over him, even though offensively you could say they're comparable, or maybe even Beasley last year certainly better, but you could say those guys are pretty comparable offensively. So I think he's primed to be a guy that if he got traded, I would be monitoring where he went, and maybe a guy, he could be traded in February, putting up stats of like 7 points per game and, maybe an assist a game or whatever. That would be a guy I would keep an eye on. If he's going to get minutes, I think he's going to produce offensively. And unfortunately, Denver has one of those good problems where they have too much young talent, and he's just a guy that I expect this year. He might overtake guys like Barton and Torrey Craig and Michael Porter Jr. He might get a lot of minutes because he is that good. But if not, then he's a guy that I think might see a minutes reduction and just not be able to show off everything he's got.
What about Monty Morris, who also stepped up big time last season, was excellent as a backup point guard, played alongside Jamal Murray at times as well. Of course, we know of that legendary assist-to-turnover ratio, 3.6 assists, 0.6 turnovers. That's ridiculous. He had a really strong shooting season as well, 41% from 3, 49% overall. Just unbelievably solid as a player. But to me, he also projects as maybe a guy that is hurt by the return of Barton and Harris, and that takes 2 minutes, 3 minutes away from the 24 he played last season.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. These minutes are probably going to, Barton and Harris are going to eat into all of the guards' minutes a little bit, so him included. I think the assist-to-turnover ratio is not going anywhere. That, to me, he is such a smart player and such an in-control player that there's a reason for 4 years in college he led NCAA in assist-to-turnover ratio. Comes into what was basically his first season in the NBA and does the exact same thing. So that's not going anywhere. The number that's really interesting to me, he shot almost 3 threes per game last year and shot over 41%. His shot chart from the floater range is just insane. I think just about 50% from 3 to 10 feet, according to Basketball Reference. One of the best floaters in the game. And both of those things, his three-point percentage and his floater, he was good at those things in college. He's great at them in the NBA in one season. And I think he's a hard worker. He's a smart worker. I believe in him as like a guy that's going to get the most out of himself. But he might have just ran hot last year in both categories. And 41% so phenomenal, he could fall to like a very healthy 37%. That's still a pretty big drop. So I think the assist to turnover ratio will stay the same, but I think some of the efficiency and shooting is likely to take at least a little dip.
Yeah, you echo what I say a lot about these guys who put up these big shooting numbers really out of nowhere, that even if they drop from 41 down to 38, 38's still really, really good. It just isn't 41, and that is a significant dip in those overall numbers. And that's really more those guys are shooting at 44, 45%, but even a guy out of nowhere like Morris shooting 41, I think we should be expecting him to be a sub 40% three-point shooter, which is still great, but yeah, that's not that same level as before. And he can be an excellent assist streamer off the waiver wire, and a guy obviously to watch if anything happens to Murray. But at this point, those minutes, if everyone is healthy, it is a little bit harder to see him get that same level of playing time he had last season. Last guy here, Mason Plumlee. What's the chances he is on this team by the end of the year?
It's a great question. I think the chances are higher than they should be. Denver has been very reluctant in the Tim Conley era to just to make big trades, and even trades that I think are somewhat necessary. So we've talked about Jeremy Grant's going to be there, Paul Millsap's going to be there. Denver could, and I think probably should, go small a lot more than they did last year, maybe with both of those guys on the court. So you're basically two power forwards and no center. And if that happens, Plumlee's minutes are already sort of lower than they should be in this Denver configuration because Jokic is there. I think he deserves more than 21 minutes per game in this league. There's most teams he would play more than that. So I do think it makes sense for Denver to sort of move on if they feel they can cover for him. And especially, I think, if they were to get somebody back in a deal that is a center that doesn't necessarily need minutes. One name I was keeping an eye on this summer was Kosta Koufis, because he's the type of guy where he's not winning you any games, but if you need him to play 10 minutes a night and that's it, he's not going to screw up. And so Denver could try to target one of those guys at the deadline. Plumlee is a guy that I think a lot of teams could use. And even if it's not a team that could use him, if you're in Atlanta or a Charlotte, just one of these young a rebuilding team, Plumlee's the perfect guy. He's a great pick and roll player. He knows how to run pick and roll. He's a great, smart defender. He does all the things that you need for young players to sort of grow. He's not going to screw up pick and roll coverage and stuff so that your guard never knows what he's supposed to do or not to do. So I do think a lot of teams will want him. I do think Denver would be smart to move on from him, especially at the deadline, kind of use him for 2/3 of the season to get a good record and then move on from him. But unfortunately, Denver doesn't always think that way, and I wouldn't be surprised if they just let his contract expire and he walked away in free agency.
He's also the NBA's king of reverse alley-oops. Seems to throw down just a ridiculous amount. I don't know why every dunk he seems to throw down is a reverse, but that's what he does. The unfortunate thing with this team being so strong is there are three guys at the back end of the rotation who I like, who are just not going to see the floor. Juancho Hernan-Gomez, Jarrett Vanderbilt, and Vlatko Cancar, who's coming across now after being drafted a couple of years ago. They're just really not going to see much playing time at all unless injuries do strike down this Nuggets team. Before I let you go, Adam, just go through my value and bust guys. I think Harris at 132 on ESPN is a great value pick, and Barton at 108, as I've already referenced, it's too high given the restrictions and how he played last year and the other players around there. Adam, thank you for jumping on, talking about this Denver team. It looks to be an exciting year for Denver. Where can people find you on Twitter?
Yes, and you can always, of course, check out Denver Stiffs as well.
Check out Denver Stiffs and Adam over on Twitter, and of course the Locked On Nuggets podcast. Adam, thanks for jumping back on with me.
You bet, buddy. Have a good one.
And that'll wrap it up for another Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast. Make sure you're subscribing Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or on Spotify and on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, give it a thumbs up. Follow me on Twitter at redrock_bball. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.